welcome to our session on secondary data. I'm Paula Swatman. I'm the chair of Swinburne University's Human Research Ethics Committee, and I'm a committee member with Bellbury. I've been doing this for a while now. And in this session, we're going to have two very experienced speakers who do some very, very interesting things with secondary data. And after they've done their brief presentation, we're going to open up to a panel session, and you can ask as many questions as you'd like. We suggest that you put the Q&A if you'd like them to be answered. And what we'd like to do ideally is save the questions until after both the presentations have taken place. I'll just do an acknowledgement before I go any further. We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Now I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who will introduce the first speaker. Thanks very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Sophie Gatenby. I am the Research Ethics Manager and Manager of the Human Research Ethics Committee at the Royal Children's Hospital. And I'm very lucky to be able to hand over and introduce Meredith O'Connor today. Meredith is our first speaker, and she's going to... I actually speak to Meredith a lot about secondary use of data issues. It's an ongoing dialogue we have between our researchers and the Ethics Office, and I'm really happy that we can continue that conversation here with a bigger audience and more input today. So hopefully we'll get some interesting conversation going. So Meredith trained as a developmental psychologist, and she now manages the Life Course platform at MCRI, and she's going to tell you more about what that is. Meredith has been working in longitudinal studies for over a decade, and we're very lucky to have her this afternoon. So over to you, Meredith.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I'll just share my screen here, if I can work that out. Always the first test of the day. Are we looking good there? Hello?
Looks good.
Yes, everything's good. Carry on.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. So as Sophie mentioned, my name's Meredith O'Connor, and I manage the Life Course platform that supports our very large hub of longitudinal cohort studies at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And today I'm really looking forward to sharing some of our experiences around secondary data analysis and some of the ethical issues that can arise along the way in those secondary data analysis projects, and that we come knocking on Sophie's door to help us think through. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many different lands that we're joining on through this virtual forum, and also to extend that respect to any Indigenous people who are joining us in this meeting. Before we get going, I also want to recognise and thank the many, many contributors who have been part of building up the Life Course platform over what's been nearly a decade, in fact, since we first got started, and particularly also thank you to the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation, whose support's been really instrumental in the establishment of the program. So for anyone not familiar with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, we're based at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, a really incredible building to come and take a look at if you're ever in the neighbourhood. And the RCH campus happens to be home to a very large hub of longitudinal cohort studies. So those studies that are following the same children and adolescents as they develop and mature over time. And these cohorts are incredibly valuable because they allow us to understand and explore those early influences on health and development over the lifespan, and to be able to identify where are those opportunities for really early prevention and intervention to set children and young people up on good health pathways throughout their lifespan. But perhaps counterintuitively, given the scientific value of these cohorts, we should never, ever embark on a new longitudinal cohort study if we can absolutely help it. And that's because they are so resource intensive to undertake and to develop a high quality longitudinal cohort. Financially, they're hugely expensive. They require that investment of funding for repeated data collections over time, and also to keep those participants engaged in the interim, in between data collections. They require the absolute blood, sweat and tears of the cohort teams who sit behind these studies. And they require a very significant and sustained investment from the participants who are offering their data not just once, but multiple times, sometimes over decades of their lives. So we need to be using those cohorts that we have to maximum advantage. But there have been challenges to leveraging longitudinal cohorts to their fullest potential. Absolutely, quite rightly, cohort custodians have a deep sense of care and concern for the well-being and for the security of participants' data, and a desire to uphold the highest standards in ethical use and reuse of this data. Also a real concern and duty of care to the cohort as a scientific resource, and not wanting to see the study brought into any form of disrepute. And so that's perfectly understandable and quite right, but unfortunately, in the absence of clear guidelines around what appropriate data sharing for longitudinal cohorts looks like, this has contributed to an oftentimes restrictive culture around data reuse for longitudinal cohort studies. The Melbourne Children's Life Course Initiative was established in 2013 with the goal of addressing some of these issues and enabling researchers, both internal and external to MCRI, both national and international, to be able to leverage these incredibly valuable longitudinal data assets to undertake meaningful and impactful research that benefits health over the lifespan. If you're curious about the Life Course platform, you can jump into our data resource profile, and you can also jump on our website to have a look around. But I'll just give you a very brief sense of how we support this reuse of these longitudinal cohorts. Our first area of focus is that we provide a metadata catalogue. This allows researchers to come and explore what data has been collected when across these cohorts. Once they've identified the cohort or cohorts that contain data that could be used to address their research question, we then provide a streamlined, centralised portal for submission of data access requests. The Life Course role in that is to provide a common structure and process for these requests that are coming through, but it's the cohort custodians who decide whether to approve or reject these requests in line with their ethics and governance structures. And hopefully these operationalised within a data sharing plan. We don't want cohorts to be making decisions in a piecemeal or reactive way when a data request comes through. Rather, they should be working in line with an established, clear, documented data sharing plan that guides them in thinking through all those many aspects of the data sharing process. And ideally would be something that they'd be considering as they establish their cohort protocol. We've recently developed a new resource for cohorts that you can find online at MCRI's Figshare, and I'll pop the link in the chat later if anyone's interested in accessing that. But it's framed as a series of discussion prompts that helps cohort teams to identify and think through what issues they need to consider in developing a data sharing plan. As well as facilitating that data sharing process, we also encourage and support cohorts to utilise common measures where appropriate and where possible. And that's because it opens this door to draw cohorts together for analysis. And I'll give an example of that later. And finally, we have a focus on building that strong and rich community of practice around the data users for these cohorts. So that gives you a sense of how we support the reuse of cohort data. But now I want to give you an applied example of a secondary data analysis project that's capitalising on the Life Course platform and some of the ethical issues that came up in that instance. So when COVID hit, our cohorts, because of their existing collaboration through the Life Course platform, were really well positioned to come together share knowledge approaches and how to solutions, as everyone was scrambling with the same question of how do we get out into the field within this new context and capture that essential data about how children and young people and their families in our cohorts are faring in this context. And Life Course's role within that was to help to facilitate this sharing of approaches and collaboration across the cohorts. But of course, there was no actual hand touching involved. We were under very strict COVID protocols being based at the hospital. Because of this collaboration across the cohorts, this has resulted in a really exceptional data resource for understanding the indirect and psychosocial impacts of the pandemic for children and young people. We had 12 studies that made that rapid pivot to collecting this information. And because of that collaboration across the cohorts, where there was this sharing of tools and new measurement approaches for capturing these COVID-related impacts, we actually have wonderfully aligned and harmonized data across those cohorts. They reflect over 6,000 children and young people, from infants right through to young adults. The really differentiating value add of these cohorts is that they were established prior to the pandemic. So they allow us to explore those long-term pathways, those existing histories, strengths and challenges of children and young people coming up to the pandemic. So we established the Life Course COVID Wellbeing Research Program as a secondary data analysis research project that's aiming to leverage this data asset. The goals of this research program are to firstly document the impact of COVID-19 for the mental health and wellbeing of children, young people and their families. And that capacity to look across these cohorts has been really valuable because it allows us to develop this kind of tapestry of the population. Our second goal here is to understand how those previous experiences and circumstances and histories leading into the pandemic have shaped risk and resilience during this time. And that's really critical because children and young people have not turned up to COVID as blank slates. They've brought to bear all of their existing challenges, assets, strengths, and experiences. So as we embarked on this research program, we developed a low negligible risk protocol for ethics. And this protocol was covering purely secondary use of the data, so no data collection and no direct engagement with participants. We have found that secondary data analysis projects don't fit neatly into most ethics protocol templates because these typically presume that there will be some collection or extraction of data. So we've actually made this protocol public again on MCRI's Big Share as an example for other secondary data analysis projects who might benefit from just seeing how we've laid out and tackled such a protocol. In terms of the ethical issues that we considered as we were developing this protocol, of course, data management and security was absolute front and center. We have previously developed a data management and research workflow framework that guides us in how we're engaging with data throughout the analysis lifecycle within this type of secondary data analysis project. Again, that's an open resource available through Figshare. It's proved extremely helpful to have that documented, explicit framework for how we're dealing with these data. One of those issues that we considered in terms of security was risk of re-identification. In this case, we were only asking to be provided with de-identified data from these cohorts, and the variables that we're examining have fairly low risk of re-identification. We're not, for example, looking at any rare conditions in these cohorts. And these lower risk data also, of course, handled in a secure and appropriate way as we've articulated within our data management framework. In regards to data access, we specified simply that we would submit our requests through the life course data access request portal. And that would provide an efficient way to submit these requests for multiple cohorts. We also specified that the decision on whether to proceed or to reject these requests would lie with the cohort custodian who would be evaluating our requests in line with their specific ethics and governance protocols. We didn't consider that it was appropriate for us as secondary data users to be putting forward some second-hand account of the complex ethics and governance processes of these individual cohorts. We really, as secondary data users who are external to those cohort teams, can't possibly hope to understand the ethics and governance processes of these cohorts in the same depth and with the same historical knowledge that those cohort teams hold. So our role here, we considered, was to put forward our data access request in a clear and comprehensive and efficient way, whereas it was up to the data custodian to decide whether or not to proceed based on their ethics and governance processes and as operationalised within their data sharing plan. Of course, one of those issues that cohort custodians need to consider when they're making that evaluation and weighing that up is the consent for data reuse and whether the proposed research that we're putting forward was in line with the parameters of that participant consent. And again, we delineated that it was the cohort custodian's role to make that evaluation in line with their data sharing protocols. As we moved forward with submitting these data access applications and having them evaluated by the data custodians, we did find that one cohort with valuable data that could really add value to these analyses didn't have explicit consent for data reuse. And this wasn't due to intention, it was just a very unfortunate phrasing of the consent form that sounded like the reuse would only be by the primary study team. So as we were considering ways to navigate this and to address this issue, we did start to develop what an argument for a waiver of consent would look like in this circumstance. And we were able to develop what we thought was a pretty compelling argument as to why a waiver of consent would be appropriate. You can see in the table here, just briefly, some of the aspects of that argument. The research being low risk, the benefits being clear and significant. As secondary data users, no direct contact with participants or way to engage with them directly, and the research being in line with what participants might reasonably expect their data to be used for. In this case, we didn't end up having to pursue this argument for a waiver of consent because the cohort custodian decided to address this issue at the source and communicate with their participants and clarify how their data was going to be reused. So that was absolutely ideal because it meant that this issue was addressed at the source. So the next 20 data users aren't each having to grapple with this issue again and again. And it was the cohort custodian who, of course, managed that contact with participants in line with their role as the cohort manager. In other circumstances where, for example, a cohort has been archived in the archiving phase, there's no active direct contact with participants, no active cohort operations team that would be managing that, then perhaps a waiver of consent could provide a very productive way forward to continue to be able to benefit from those data. So as we've gone forward and navigated that ethics and data access processes, we've now got to the stage where we've been grappling with the data itself and starting to draw out those insights from the data that really only these longitudinal cohorts with those pre-pandemic data can address these specific questions that we've been looking at. And we're gaining some really policy relevant insights. For example, in terms of how mental health has changed for groups of children prior to and then during the pandemic, we found that while mental health impacts were very common across the population for children and young people, there has been a real clear exacerbation of those difficulties for young people who were already struggling with mental health prior to the pandemic. So that gives us some clear implications for a priority group for targeting of mental health services. We're currently working to summarise some of these findings and their policy implications, and we will have a research brief covering this that will be accessible via the MCRI website in hopefully just a couple of weeks away now. So just a few reflections to end on from my perspective as a secondary data user working with the Life Course platform. I think analysing these existing longitudinal cohort data is incredibly respectful to participant contributions. I think participants would reasonably expect that their data is going to be used to its fullest potential to benefit health over the lifespan, and in the current case carries negligible additional risk for participants. Cohorts need to be planning for data sharing at the outset of their study and when they're developing their protocols for their study, not reacting and trying to figure it out and scramble to deal with the first data request that comes through. They really should have a clear, transparent, documented data sharing plan that's guiding their approaches to specific requests that are coming through, and that is of course aligned to their ethics and governance processes. And cohort teams hold the cohort's history and management. It's their role to develop these data sharing protocols and to be responsible for those, not the secondary data user who really can't hope to have that level of knowledge and depth of understanding of that cohort, where conversations about consent for data reuse, for example, are really an ongoing dialogue happening with these participants over years and sometimes decades. On the other hand, secondary data users need clear protocols about how they're managing and working with the data during their analytic project. So if we can support cohort teams in best practice to data sharing, and if we can support secondary data users in developing best practice protocols around how they're handling these data in their studies, we can really maximise the value of these longitudinal cohorts, capitalise on these cohorts to achieve the significant public health benefit that they're capable of providing, and while managing risks to participants. So thank you so much, and I'll stop share there.
Thank you so much, Meredith. That was fantastic and great information about longitudinal cohorts, which is not something that people talk about all the time with secondary data. Although, as you point out, it's a really valid area. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker for today, Professor Susan Rossell. Susan is Professor of Cognitive Neuropsychiatry and an NHMRC Senior Research Fellow at Swinburne University in Melbourne, and also Chair of Research for Psychiatry at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. Her research is focused on understanding the cognitive impairments involved in psychosis, mood disorders, and body image-related disorders, aiming to develop new interventions for these debilitating cognitive symptoms. As you can see, this is a very different area of research from Meredith, and Susan has some very different perspectives on secondary data. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks there, Paula. And a real pleasure to be talking to you guys today. You can see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Okay, I'll get on with it then. I've been at Swinburne for the last 10 years and have had the pleasure to work with Paula across a number of different projects. I think she says I bombard her ethics committee monthly. But prior to being at Swinburne, I was actually at Monash, and it was about 16 years ago. I saw potential in some of my data collection that wasn't really being seen through to fruition. And I began the foundations of what now is a really comprehensive, multimodal and productive data bank that has really meant that I send through to ethics now on a regular basis applications for secondary data use. And it is this data bank that I am going to talk to you about today, why I set it up and how it's being used. So just to give you guys some context, as Paula has introduced, I work with participants with serious mental health conditions. These include schizophrenia, mood disorder, body dysmorphia, anorexia. And we're really trying to push the boundaries of our understanding with these conditions, especially with regards to cognition. I'm a neuropsychologist by background, and trying to create and conjure up novel interventions for said cognitive problems. So as part of the research that we do, we've got this very multimodal set of data collection. So we do engage with clients who often spend up to 3 hours giving us detailed clinical interviews about their histories. They give us blood samples, urine samples. Some of our studies have even got fecal samples. We do comprehensive neuroimaging, which includes MRI, MEG, EEG. A great deal of our studies also look at eye tracking, cognitive testing, qualitative interview. As you can see, every single person that comes through every one of our studies, there is an absolutely astronomical amount of data that we get from them to try and create the best biopsychosocial models that we can to think of these new interventions that might alleviate some of their symptoms. So what was I thinking? Well, I was thinking, all of these studies that I'm embarking on require multiple staff and HDR students, often working with the same patients, often working with the same mental health condition, often working with a great deal of the same data collection. So I might have one student that would be doing the very detailed clinical interview and looking at it in relation to eye tracking, and another person doing a detailed cognitive interview and looking at it in relation to neuroimaging. So we've got, all of these correspondences across the studies. And the other thing is, 16 years ago, I had almost no money to do any of these studies. So I'm thinking, I've got multiple people working on very similar things. I've got very limited funding. And this is of critical importance. The conditions I work with, although some of them are rare, some of them aren't. So body dysmorphia is rare, but schizophrenia, not so much. But they're really hard to recruit. They're hard to engage. They're hard to get into the lab. They're hard to try and find in mental health systems. And then there were other things that were kind of on my mind. We've got these rapid developing technologies. The analysis that we did in genetics 16 years ago is certainly far inferior to what we use now. And, as a researcher that's worked in the field for a very long time, there are always these kind of hypotheses that I knew that would be created in the future that maybe we could answer from some of the old data. We had, with the conditions that we study, and they're hard to recruit, a single PhD student might only get 30 in their entire candidature of patients with a particular condition. But there are some questions that we would need to answer that would require substantively more numbers. So, if we had a data bank with, say, 100 of these people with this condition, we could certainly increase power. And it would certainly increase collaborative opportunities. So this is why we decided to come up with our data bank. Now, At the time, 16 years ago, there was a massive challenge with this. I was actually at the Alfred Hospital and Monash, as I've alluded to, and there was no culture in terms of setting up data banks. There were no templates. People didn't do this. It was a complete unknown. Of course, I also needed to, instead of finding the time and resources of staff to work on the projects that they were working on, try and find some funds to set this up. And then I've had to find funds to maintain the data bank as well. So we were quite fortunate that I was in my infancy in time in Australia 16 years ago and not been here very long. And so in terms of changing the consent forms to enable secondary use and continued use and use of the data into a data bank, that was actually one of my most easy things to do. What wasn't easy at the time, and I remember going to multiple ethic meetings, was talking about indefinite use of data and, you know, future unthought of hypotheses. The ethics committee at the Alfred were not super happy about this at the time. However, we did get it over the line, and I think we were one of the first people to get it over the line. So one of the things that they really got us to think about is who was going to access the data. And this was a significant challenge for us. I think in comparison to the previous talk, you'll see that the way that I set it up was quite different because we were, you know, very early in the process. So at the time, we said that only people that were directly working with me, so my staff or my students, should access the data. And that seemed to satisfy all of the problems that we were coming up with in terms of getting ethics for our data bank at the time. But we have faced additional challenges over the years in setting up the data bank with, you know, incomplete information across various different studies. And the various feeder studies all been in different data formats. We have rectified these problems over the years, and we're a lot more efficient at setting up feeder studies now to make sure that when we put them, when we've got them set up, they can directly feed into the data bank. So other challenges over the years as we've been moving forward is the access to the records or the data. So as Meredith, our patients are de-identified and are given a code, but often this is quite difficult with the people that come into our studies, where you might be able to identify them quite easily because of their rare condition or because of the presentation being very unique with the condition that they have. Some of the people that engage in my research are quite well-known TV celebrities who are quite talkative about their body image issues, for example, and I won't share obviously the identification with anyone, but just if you engage in any sort of program that has, you know, investigated people with complex and excessive cosmetic surgery, you might come across somebody that has body dysmorphia and would have been in one of my studies over the years. So as I spoke about who should have the data at the moment, and it's still the case, only people in my team should have the data. And I will talk to you about what kind of data they get access to in the next slide. We have the same kind of security and storage of records that we would for any of our studies. I think that hasn't really been a factor in the database, and we make sure that everything is password protected and encrypted. I mean, the advantages for us setting up this database should be pretty straightforward to everyone. We now have easy access to some really comprehensive clinical data that takes a long time to collect. It's low cost. We can ask additional research questions that might have been unforeseen in when we're coming up with the original feeder studies. And we have created something that really is quite multidisciplinary, whereas, you know, the individual feeder projects might have just been a single discipline. So this is really starting to move the field forward in quite a more comprehensive way than previously. So this is how the database is situated at the moment. So I have been quite fortunate over the years to manage to score some money to employ a database manager or custodian who keeps his beady eye on everything. And within that, we were able to come up with quite a comprehensive set of procedures in order to access the data in the data bank. There's a set of instructions, and I'm very happy to share these with you about what the data is in the data bank, how to get access to it, and what sorts of projects would be seen as feasible. Given all of the participants in our data bank have already given consent for the use of secondary data, this has not been an issue for us. So what we also have, as well as the data manager and custodian, is we have a review process by a set of people that were involved in some of the original feeder studies, and we review the academic and scientific kind of excellence of the project. And some projects we have turned down, and I guess we always keep in the back of our mind how sensitive and valuable this data is and how much the field can be pushed forward. But if we don't think that the data is being used in I guess a scientifically interesting way, or it's kind of it's a not interesting project, we haven't let it go forward. HREC at Swinburne now receives probably, I would say, at least an application a month from various students and staff members that want access to the secondary data. And one of the things that we have been incredibly fortunate being at Swinburne is we have had some really fantastic support from Paula and her team to come up with templates for the students and the staff members so we can get those through quite rapidly. When the application is successfully through the HREC, we prepare a data file for the individuals, which is you've got the relevant variables in and doesn't actually have the rest of the data bank. So we keep all of the information, the rest of the information sensitive and not the whole data bank available to people. So how has this worked for us? Well, I think that there's some really fantastic examples of recent success and recently papers that would never have been achievable if it hadn't have been for the data bank. And I'll just talk through in the last few minutes that I've got a couple of those papers that have appeared in really some top quality international mental health journals. The first on the screen there was a genetics study, which certainly wouldn't have been available when we collected the data. So that data was collected over a 16-year period, and obviously, as you can see from the date, was published earlier this year. And this was a genetics study where we were looking at cognitive phenotypes. And in order to do the study, we had to collect a very large group of people with schizophrenia and divide them into those that had a cognitive deficit and those that didn't have a cognitive deficit. And then the geneticist on the team, Brian Dean, who was working with us, did an expression study and showed some really quite profound differences in gene expression in relation to cognition. I'm sort of aware that I might run out of time, so I'm just missed that one because the other two I think are just as critical, are actually more important to talk about. This was an international study that we were approached to take part in based on some data, some neuroimaging data that we had. We have over the years done some really comprehensive studies looking at how to explain auditory hallucinations, what are their neurobiological pathways, how does our brain produce hallucinations. And it's a really complex area. We were approached by Todd Woodward in Canada, given our comprehensive data set, and he'd already spoken to 2 other centres that had similar data, so one in the Netherlands and one in France. So he was able to combine his data in Canada with our Australian and then the French and the Dutch data to produce a real novel look at how hallucinations are represented in the brain. And one of the important things about this finding was that it does actually directly criticise and go against the entire of the rest of a 25-year literature, and shows different pathways and a different system to what had been published previously, and suggests that some of the previous work was actually quite confounded with problems with scanning. So I think, and it gave us a really unique understanding of what might be happening with this particular symptom. And then the last paper is probably the one that I am the most proud of, because it's something I'm really passionate about. So body dysmorphia is really grossly understood, and there are very few researchers in the world that have managed to gain access to enough patients to even remotely comment on the phenomenology and nosology of the disorder. So this paper actually represents 3 different PhD students that I had over a period spanning about 10 years, Amy, Sarah and Sally, and each of them collected about 25 patients with BDD. We wouldn't have been able to do this study, and we wouldn't have been able to do this phenomenological investigation with just 25. So in the final paper, there were 75 patients, and we were able to show something quite unique in terms of their cognitive profile. It was a labour of love, and we got there in the end, but also we were able to show something quite unique about this particular cohort that nobody had ever been able to do because they hadn't had the sample sizes that were needed to do this kind of investigation. So from my point of view, setting up this data bank has both been rewarding and also very respectful for the mental health patients that we see with our studies. It's produced some novel results that wouldn't have been possible without being able to pool the data and then look at it in a secondary way. And I think really critically for me, it really guides my future research in unknown directions by having access to not only comprehensive multimodal data, but also powerful enough sample sizes to ask questions that I wouldn't have been able to. And I'll thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was great. I'm glad that my camera was turned off because my blushes would have been considerable during that. Thank you for your very kind comments. That was fantastic. And as you can see, as I said at the beginning, we've got 2 quite different perspectives. They're not in any way contradictory, but they're complementary from Meredith and Susan, who've said some things that were similar and some things that each of them said things that the other didn't say. So I'm now going to hand over to Sophie for the second half of this session, where we're going to answer questions and set up a panel. Thanks, Sophie.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Paula, and thanks, Susan and Meredith, for both your talks. They were great. Peter, I can see that you've sent us through a chat question, which we will address, but I think we might start with doing a couple of polls, because I think having had these different perspectives on secondary use of data, it'll be a good place to start and maybe get us thinking about how we do this practically when it comes to ethics and the things we think about. So, Sarah, if you please, could you put the first poll on for the group? So the first poll is, when reviewing an application using secondary data, so say you're a committee, perhaps you're a researcher, and if you're a researcher, perhaps you can think about what your committee requests. When reviewing an application using secondary data, do you / your committee request the original information statement consent form to be provided as part of the review process? So the first answer is yes for all submissions accessing secondary data. The second response is yes, only when the data is identifiable. Then you've got no or not sure. So we'll give everybody a minute or 2, less than a minute, second or two to put their responses in, and just the best answer for you. How explicit is the consent which is obtained in terms of secondary use of data? Is this for the, Angela, does this relate to this relates to the polls? How explicit is the consent which is obtained in the terms of secondary use of data? Does it limit who can use the data and for what types of use, for instance? Well, I think in this hypothetical, it could be either. We haven't said what the terms of consent are. So what we're asking in this poll is whether or not you would ask for as a committee or as a reviewer, you would want to see the information statement consent form that related to that consent, or you would accept some other way of being informed, or if it's you take the role of the data custodian as someone making a decision for releasing that data. Okay, cool. Sorry, Angelo, my apologies. So the question related to the speakers rather than the poll. All right, we'll keep that one. We'll just see how the poll is going.
Shall I end the poll, Sophie?
Yeah, end the poll,
Yep.
show it up, and then we'll return to Angelo's question, and then we'll go to Peter's.
Okay, sharing the results now.
Interesting. So 50% of the group would say yes, all submissions accessing secondary data would ask for the consent forms. And 15% only when it's identifiable, 7% no, and 28% not sure. So I think the other thing to think about here, so if you are a yes for this 50% that says yes, something to think about while we go into the Q&A is that every single iteration of consent that has ever been given for that study, because of course if it's a longitudinal study, in Meredith's example, we have many iterations of consent that have happened over many years. So I would be interested to know how the other committee, from that answer, it indicates to me that the answer is yes, but that's something that we often get a question about from our researchers, or we'll be talking to our researchers about, will be, do we, yes, of course, here's the consent form we use, but then we go, well, we go back 10 years, there might be 10 different consent forms, and you might have different terms of consent attached to a big sample of a population or a group. So interesting answers. I'll close that one off. So we might return to a couple of the Q&A questions, and we'll go back to Angelo's question. So the question was, how explicit is the consent which is obtained in the terms of consent for secondary use of data? Does it limit who can use the data for what types of use, for instance? So that was a question for the group. I'm just trying to work out if does this relate to a specific speaker, Angelo, or just all of the speakers, both the speakers? And or can you be more specific about in which situation? So I guess there could be lots of different, either speaker, but both suggested they had obtained consent. Oh,
I can answer that. So because I set this up, 16 years ago, so all of the consent forms that are signed from my what I call feeder studies have a statement in saying that they're going to be given a different consent form for their data to be entered into a data bank, and then they're given the form for the data bank. So that's how we did it, and with explicit information with regards to the data bank that it's for unforeseen use.
I can provide some perspective from the life course cohorts. One of the really interesting things that Sophie's mentioned about the longitudinal studies context is that the initial consent that that family might have given could be 40 years ago, because that's our longest running study. And you can imagine how restrictive that original consent was, reflecting what was considered best practice at the time. But consent for these long running studies is an ongoing dialogue, and there'll be multiple reconsenting over time, as well as other communications that come through to participants about how their data is being used and reused for research. So the more recent iterations of those reconsenting will be reflective of current thinking, and specifies a really broad potential for future reuse that, where appropriate, isn't placing any limitations on what that might involve. Another feature of these cohorts is that they're not set up to answer one, very, very specific question. They're set up to allow a data resource that's capable of answering questions that we haven't even thought about when we actually go out into the field and collect data. So interesting context there, maybe from the longitudinal studies side.
Can I add to that from a straightforward HREC perspective? It really depends on the research and on what the history of consent was. Because if it turns out that you're trying to, your applicants, your investigators want to access data which comes from a series of international databases, then there's not going to be any access at all to the original consent form. So that's got to be done via a waiver of consent. But sometimes we get applications, and I have seen, not at Swinburne, but at other ethics committees I've sat on, where somebody will say, for example, a specialist surgeon may say, well, I've got consent from my patients. Look, I've got a consent form they sign, but it's the consent form that they sign when they go under anesthesia that says, while I'm unconscious, you can do anything that you discover that you need to do. And I will say, but that's not consent to research. That's consent for you to do surgery on them. So the consent has to be relevant to what it is that you're asking for. So it's really, I think I would say it's a horses for courses situation. It's a question of what they're asking, where the data came from, and what sort of consent was originally provided.
Thanks, Paula. So we might go to Peter's question now. So Peter Miller asked, with the use of secondary data, have ethics committees or researchers considered the cultural side of using data? So the analysis or subset analysis with using a data set of First Nations people, for example.
From the life course perspective, one of the important and very significant limitations of our cohorts is the underrepresentation of children and young people and families from First Nations backgrounds, and also children and young people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And this reflects some of the limitations of our cohort methodologies, where cohorts, particularly those established many decades prior, we haven't done as good a job at retaining those families and making sure that participation is engaging and appropriate for those families in our cohorts. So I have to say, for many of our cohorts, it's not such an issue, but for a bad reason, that we don't actually have those participants represented in our cohorts. But there are new cohorts like Generation Victoria, for example, that's aiming to engage all families who are having giving birth to a child in the next year or two, and gain that population kind of coverage. And I know data sovereignty is very much on the agenda for those cohorts.
Thanks, Meredith. Susan, did you have anything to add to that?
I would almost have given the same answer, so I won't say any more, because we've had exactly the same issues.
So I'll just add something from an ethics committee, ethics office point of view. The only thing I would add, Peter, is we would have a slightly more layered process for reviewing a project, even if it was just data, and you might be well aware of this, but if we had a data project that was focusing on Indigenous First Nations people, we would make sure that there was a level of review in place that involved involvement from Indigenous and First Nations people, so that wouldn't be, and it would go to the Human Research Ethics Committee, even if it was just data, to make sure that we did a more layered review that met the requirements of review and research in First Nations people. So that was just from my part, but the next question we have is from Anonymous.
Before you do that, sorry,
Yes?
there's a comment here from Sarah who says, if an audience member wants to ask a question, can they raise their hand and she can give them permission to speak?
Perfect. Good housekeeping. Thanks, Sarah. So I'll go back to Anonymous. So should a waiver of consent be applied to all secondary use of data if no original consent can be provided, unless, of course, it's exempt from ethical review? So I guess we could take this in a couple of ways. We could say maybe we physically don't have a consent form, or maybe so we don't have. If we went back to the first poll, we asked whether you ask for a PICF for a study. So this could be that we don't have a consent form, or we don't have evidence of the consent. Unless, of course, it's exempt from ethical review. And I'm trying to think of the terms of exemption, and that would be low risk and very negligible risk research and completely de-identified data. So I think, what are your thoughts around that, Susan and Meredith? Waiver of consents being applied to secondary use of data if no consent can be provided.
I wouldn't do it, but that's because of the type of data that I'm working with. I think it would. I'm a clinician as well, so I want to make sure that that the views of my participants are represented with the data that they give me. So I wouldn't do it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely going to be one of those questions where the answer is it depends on the circumstances.
Depends on the data.
Certainly,
Yeah.
when we were considering submitting a waiver of consent for access to cohort data, we did feel that we were able to develop a very strong argument, but this related to aspects of that data. For example, the data was collected for research use. It was not clinical data. The participants had signed up to be part of a research study with child and adolescent health, the focus. The risks associated with the data was also very low. And as I mentioned, we had really clear, really explicit and well thought through processes around how we as secondary data users were going to be engaging with that data to ensure that it was handled in a safe and secure manner, which is a really essential part of this as well, I think. So depends on the circumstances, I would say, but in some cases, I do think it could be a productive way forward when you can see that health benefit is there and the risk can be appropriately managed.
Thank you, Meredith. I think we might pop up another poll. Now, Sarah, I said to you, yes, let's do poll 2. So this is just a little bit out of left field, but we'll talk about this one. If you're reviewing applications that use social media data, would you so again, if you're a research ethics committee or you're a researcher that submits to a research ethics committee and you have experience with the process or requirements of your own ethics committee, if you're reviewing applications that use social media data, would you ask for evidence of consent or an application for a waiver if the site requires a user ID and password? And then 2, if you're reviewing applications that use social media data, would you ask for evidence of consent or application of a waiver if it's a publicly available site? So both yes or no answers. can't see how things are going with the poll. Sarah, do you give it another minute?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you could see.
No, no, I'm just being awkwardly silent. I can just.
Okay, slowing down, so I'll end the poll and share.
Thanks. Okay,
Aha. I thought that might happen.
so I'll hand over to Paula because this was Paula's question.
Yep, this is a pet question of mine. In fact, it's equally required for both of them. And it's amazing how many people have not read that part of the national statement. It's questions 3.1.51 to 54. And essentially, it doesn't matter whether the data are public or not. People have not given consent for research. The fact that they have told their most private and sensitive information to the entire world on Facebook or on Twitter or on YouTube or any other social medium does not mean that they've given consent for the data to be used in research. So you have to treat both exactly the same way, even though one is public and the other is private. It's a trick question, sorry guys. You're muted, Sophie.
We might actually jump to the third poll because it really relates to what we were discussing just previously, and then we'll go to Fiona's question. I can see. So this poll is about the national statement and waivers of consent. So the national statement in section 2.3.10, before deciding to waive the requirement for consent, other than in the case of research aiming to expose illegal activity, a HREC or other review body must be satisfied that there is no known or likely reason for thinking that participants would not have consented if they had been asked. Which of the following do you think is an appropriate response? So this is one that we've discussed a little bit earlier today during the genetic session and the consent session, and in the genetic session and the session following. And interested to know your thoughts about what you think's the best answer here.
But people are still responding.
Yeah. This one, may need to think a little bit so we can.
Okay, starting to slow responses. Shall I end the poll?
End the poll. Let's see.
Okay.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting that the second two were split. So only a small proportion said if the researchers have good relationships with the participants. And then the second two were very evenly split, which is correct, because I think both of those are more acceptable reasons for justifying against that criteria for there's no known or likely reason they would have said no. So thanks for participating in that one. I'll just pick up where Fiona perhaps had mentioned in the chat when we were talking about social media just before, that their HREC asks for the terms and conditions of a social media site's specific policies on third-party use of data. So these are required to be provided with an application, which is an interesting way, a different way of getting that data, and part of the social media assessment. I guess that's another area that
it's absolutely correct, though. It just that's section 3.1.54 of the national statement says that you must have approval from the administrator of the site.
Cool. All right, do we have any more questions, or does anybody want to raise their hand and speak to the group? Oh, here we go. Sorry, we do have a new question from Evan. Evan's question is, there was a mention of the need of tailoring a secondary data request if the information pertains to First Nation cohorts. What is the circumstance when such individuals are included, coincidentally in a larger cohort, where the study is not specifically directed to them? So from my comment before related to the level of review that would go into a project looking at data of, and it has to be targeted, so a targeted review of data of First Nations people. We would expect that there would be involvement from First Nations researchers or First Nations consumer involvement in the development of that protocol, and depending on our resourcing and capacity at the time as a HREC, we would seek expert review, independent expert review from an Indigenous researcher as well on that study. That's how we would do it. But there's a few, I mean, that's our framework, and there'd be different process frameworks from different HRECs and different research ethics officers. Gordon's got something to say.
Do you mind if I just comment on that, Sophie? And
yes,
it's a great point, because look, I was on one of the Indigenous reference groups, and they went through this process. So someone asked if they could use secondary data, and whether they could just go through an HREC, and almost to a one, almost to the whole group of Indigenous reference group members, they said, absolutely no way. This has to go back for consent. So this is a really important point, that you can't just give it to your HREC. You know, it's a lot more important than that. And so to think that you can just get through with your waiver of consent sort of demeans the process and really doesn't take into account the views of those whose data it is. And I actually think it's something we should take a lot more seriously, by the way. And I'm not saying this is being trivialized, but you know, from Greg Pratt's comments today, it really is something we have to consider more seriously than that. So anyway, just my comment, but it was
I don't disagree with. I think that's I agree wholeheartedly with that comment, and I guess that from our HREC's point of view, we add in that level of review and make sure that engagement has been is part of the review process. We wouldn't review a project as a HREC until it had had engagement from a consumer group or Indigenous review.
Yeah, and that's right, Sophie. But I guess what I'm getting at is they believe there's actually a need to reconsent. People,
I think we would expect that to come out in the review.
Very good.
That
okay.
level of review, that if there needed to be reconsent, we'd say, okay, well, that's what the consumer group or the Indigenous advisory group have said. We would expect you to go back and get that consent before it comes to HREC.
So just as
I think to be fair, Evan was only asking about incidental, where you're not targeting Indigenous
I'm sure,
people.
Paul. I just wanted to point out that as a general rule, you know, I think it's something that as ethics committees we have to consider, probably in the way Sophie suggests, and not consider that an ethics committee per se can actually make that decision as it relates to the secondary use of data of First Nations or indeed some other groups.
Both good points. I think Evan was talking about when the secondary use is targeted, but the primary collection was coincidental. So I think that level of review would need to be put in place for the secondary use. Yeah. That would be my thing.
Otherwise, you'd have to be careful. Every single secondary data analysis would have to go to an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander group for approval before you could review secondary data. Like, one has to be realistic. If you're not actually targeting Indigenous First Nation people, then you don't have to treat the data any differently than you would treat any other data.
Yeah. Thanks, Paula. Yes, point taken. Absolutely agree.
Cool. Okay, can I ask if anybody's got any more questions that they'd like to ask the panel? And you can put up your hand and talk if you'd like. Oh, we've got a hand, I think. Sarah?
I think Evan actually wants to say something. He's had a couple of goes.
Yeah, go for it. I've given permission.
But he's muted.
I've asked him to unmute. Hang on.
Sorry, I misread the little sign. I thought I was unmuted and trying to mute myself, but thanks you answered the, my question was answered. But if I am speaking, I just thought I'd mention to something related, is that often on HREAs, there's a section where a whole lot of boxes are ticked, like does the protocol refer to prisoners or people who are with diminished responsibility? And usually there's a box that comes out for people of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin. And in the same way as the boxes to say that prisoners and a whole lot of others are excluded, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the box ticked as well to say that so it would imply from the form that they're actually to be excluded. And something I've thought is that whether there needs to be something to say whether a protocol might coincidentally include them when really they'd be looked as part of anyone who can participate, as distinct from studies that is specifically looking at them, when all the cultural and ownership aspects have to be taken into consideration. So I'm sorry if I've gone on a bit about that.
Don't be sorry. So are you asking whether, do you think that the form draws out things ineffectively, the HREC is drawing out or is misleading when people are filling it out?
Well, it's just that I felt that the form as it stands, if the box has an X, it usually means that such populations are excluded when the intent is not.
Oh, I understand what you mean. So the form is sort of making you answer in such a way that you're excluding a group when really it's just that you're not targeting them.
That's right, yes.
Okay, yes. I haven't looked at the form for a while, but I do vaguely recall what you mean. I think there is some confusion with that, and that might be something we can feed back to the HREC, like the NHMRC HREC people on making sure, letting them know that there's some confusion with that.
Thank you.
Sophie, I'm just going to comment on that because I don't think there's a need to reflect this back to the HREA people. The fact of the matter is, in any broad spectrum of research, you're going to include a broad cross-section. And, you know, if I only incidentally include a particular group, it still means that I should, you know, potentially consider what the effect is on them. You know, you can't just expect it to be absolute. I'm only considering one group, because research is such that you are considering more than just one particular group. So I think the onus is on not ethics committees per se, but on those who wish to use the data to consider whose data will be used in total and how that will be used, and consider what cultural or other sensitivities must be taken into account. I do believe the HREA is broad enough to consider that.
You're breaking up a bit, Gordon. You're breaking up a bit.
Not stop there. I think hopefully I've made my point, but it's not about the HREA, it's about researchers here.
Saro, do we have another hand up?
No, that was just Evan.
Okay, cool. So it's not
That's
another
lower.
one. Okay. So we've got another question, but I don't know if this is for this session, but we could try and give it a go. So Shilpi's asked, my question is for the previous session on consent. What are the considerations for engaging CULD populations, so culturally and linguistically diverse populations, when obtaining consent? Is the use of an interpreter service sufficient?
What, with secondary data?
No, it's
Or-
not with
or
secondary
not?
data. I think this relates to the
Oh,
last.
we've just kind of segued into a totally different topic.
Yeah, I think this relates to the last session.
Yes,
So we might put that one to
the people from the last session.
to the people from the last session and get back to you.
Hmm.
Were there any more questions?
I guess what would be quite interesting would be to ask both Meredith and Susan if any of their data, because often I know they have consent forms, if they have people who are from sort of fairly extreme populations. I know Susan often has people who have psychiatric levels of extremeness, if I can invent that word. How do you go about making sure that the consent has been genuine consent before you actually start using the data?
Sorry, I was trying to get it off mute. Yeah, I mean, it is one of the issues that the team deal with all the time. We have quite a sort of strict set of guidelines that the PhD students aren't allowed to do it on their own. They have to have someone else on with them that has considerable clinical experience. They often don't want to read the pages of consent forms that that you've had to meticulously prepare, and so we talk them through it on at least 2 occasions. One usually on the phone, and then another time face to face. And even though they might get a little fed up with us talking sometimes at them, we do really have to make sure that they understand every little bit of the information. And so we do it in sort of sometimes a little bit more of a conversational way. Have you understood how many hours this is going to be? Have you understood what you're going to do? And and so turning it back on them in terms of asking questions, I think, is one of the critical ways of doing that. And sometimes we when there's question marks, we kind of go, I can really tell you're not feeling very well today. And look, I can see that you really want to do this research. Maybe, shall we pop back and talk to you about this next week? And we have had a lot of research over the years where people are inpatients, and so that's quite easy to do. When they're outpatients and have made special effort to come into an appointment, we try not to do that if we can. And with those kinds of clients where we're a little bit concerned, multiple telephone calls, I think, and speaking, making sure that they speak to the same person each time, even if there are the more senior people listening in, so you're not getting different perspectives, you're kind of keeping on a sort of line of conversation going. And yeah, sometimes it's tricky.
Yeah. Meredith, what about you? You've got different problems because you're dealing with children and their parents, aren't you?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I said, they're very complementary perspectives that I think we're bringing, Susan. So we're seeing across our cohorts a whole range of different approaches to addressing this issue. And I think it's one of those examples where inclusivity benefits everyone. If we know that, for example, reading level, we need to keep to a certain threshold and have complementary engagement methods and so on. I think it actually benefits everyone, because can you imagine parents of a new baby, for example, they're in a charged and potentially stressful situation. Trying to take in a great deal of dry written information can be very difficult. So we've seen some different types of approaches to complement that. For example, short animations is something I've been seeing more of lately. We saw a good example of that recently, where one of the cohorts was reconsenting participants to allow for linkage to administrative data. It sounds like such a complicated thing, linkage to administrative data, but when you boil it down, it's actually can be entertaining in that and very understandable. So I think these are some of the kind of opportunities that we have with new technologies, new ways of working, and thinking about how we get a bit creative to ensure that communication is effective with these groups.
I think the other thing our cohorts need to think about dealing with children and initially consenting children is that secondary use and that ongoing use of data into the future, because the original consent will often be with the parent. And I think Meredith did mention that they'll have subsequent waves, and at some point in a wave we'll get an amendment to the ethics office or to the committee to ask for, we'd now like to consent the children to take part in the study, because previously all the consent had been from the parent. So I guess another thing to think about with secondary use, if that data is de-identified, if we don't get that consent from the child when it ticks over to the time when the child is now of age to give consent, is that data accessible for secondary use, or do we give that child the opportunity to withdraw the data, so that now is no longer part of the data to be used into the future because the child's made a decision not to continue? Or and how do you do that? I mean, that's all about planning and setting up at the beginning, so you can contact people, that you have terms and conditions really laid out at the beginning. I mean, I know at the Children's Hospital we deal with this a lot, with this issue of reconsenting, and we know that parental consent is legally withstanding if they get consent from the parent for use, but then the ethical question is different. Should you be going back and getting consent from kids, and do you have the ability to reconsent these kids who you may have lost contact with, or their data might have been de-identified, so you don't know whose data it is? So it's an interesting issue that we deal with regularly, and more it's all about really planning for those things, like what will happen in the future. And there's been a real shift in the last decade that I've been working at the Children's Hospital, and I know that this will be a similar experience for everybody, is that there's been a shift from saying we'll never use this data for anything but this research project ever, and that was how we used to coin all our consent forms. We were very explicit about the use of the data being for this project only, by these researchers only. And in the last decade, that's really shifted to being, we will use de-identified data for de-identified being something that we need to define, because obviously it's different for different data sets, but we will use data into the future because we want to get the most utility out of this data without further burden. And that is seen as a respectful thing to do when it's within the scope of research that people have consented to. And that's what the NHMRC put advice out about utility of data about, I think it was 2018. So there's been this real shift in how we consent people and what we tell people, and that's, I mean, with longitudinal studies, we're dealing with consent forms that have been created 10 years ago, and the change in the language is so significant, and the change in what we're promising is so significant, and it's really a reflection of what is socially acceptable now, and what people's expectations are. And I think it'll change again with all these privacy breaches. You have to think about how you're going to word things again. So, it's always changing, and the HREC and consumers play a really important role in providing that public pulse of what's acceptable to do with data at a given point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. We have cohorts that have been so long running that the primary participant is the baby when the family is recruited, but those babies grow up and actually transition to adulthood, and even go on to have their own babies who then get reconsented into the study. So it's a real transition point when the young person is coming up to that age where they are really stepping up as young adults. And one of the intricacies that we've found in thinking about consent and ethical issues around that is, what about the parents who were contributing data, oftentimes about themselves and their family along the way, and how does our relationship between the cohorts and the parents change? Do we need, permission from the child to engage with the parents, or that kind of thing? So it raises a lot of ethical thinking that needs to take place, and a real transition moment for the study. Yeah.
Very true. I don't have any more questions, but Paula, Susan, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I'm not sure. I'll quick look at. Oh, yes. Susan mentioned, you mentioned when you were first talking about the fact that some populations are innately identifiable, that there is absolutely no way of de-identifying certain people. I mean, I remember being involved in a study myself. We were looking at genetic illnesses in a population as small as Australia. There are certain illnesses that's known to only affect one family in one state. You've got a different problem, haven't you, with the sort of research you do?
Yeah, especially the body image and the BDD stuff. As I said, there's quite a few celebrities that are constantly on documentaries and the news who are very open about having the condition and talk quite a lot about the different kind of distresses and I guess mental health symptoms that they experience. So it's enormously difficult to hide their identity. But at the same token, I mean, if they're in the public eye so much talking about this, they don't want their identity hidden. But that's not true for all of them. So you know, we're very clear with people when they engage in our research programs, you know, what we're going to be asking them to do and what kinds of data that they're going to be giving to us. And sometimes some people have said no. So there's the condition, one of the conditions that we've worked on is people with body identity integrity disorder. And for those that don't know, which would probably be most of you, it's where people want to have a limb removed because they no longer feel that it belongs to them, and it's an incredibly rare condition. I've only ever managed to see 5 people in my entire career, and we have published some data with one individual who was quite happy for the data that we collected to be published, but a couple of the others decided to withdraw consent after we collected data, and that was okay. And look, and that's what it is. We used the data to help with their clinical care and what was going on in the clinical services. So as far as I'm concerned as a clinician, it was useful for them to take part in the research. Unfortunately, the rest of the community can't know about how it did affect their treatment plan, but that's the way that things go sometimes. So I guess it's just being cognizant of the people that you're working with and being very open and you know, talking through all the issues that are going to arise if their data is out there in the public arena.
I think that's an important issue, and you've also raised another issue, which is that people can withdraw consent. So you can find yourself in a situation where people have said, yes, we're happy for you to use my data in the future or to share it with somebody else, and then suddenly they say no.
And that's the research, isn't it?
Yeah. Do tell the ethics committee though.
Yes, of course I do.
All right,
Gordon, you're muted. You're muted, Gordon. We can't hear you.
Apologies. Paula, would you care to wrap up roundabout now?
Yeah, I would.
Since we're just at that time.
And we're getting to the end of time. We're getting to the end. Okay. Well, look, thank you to everybody. First of all, to our panelists who have given us some absolutely fascinating talks on 2 quite different and complementary aspects of the use of secondary data. And one of the things that fascinated me most is how much they agreed. When anybody asked questions, they almost invariably agreed with one another, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. And also to Sophie, who did so much work pulling all this together, and to Sarah, who put enormous amounts of effort into helping us, and to Gordon, who of course is the only begetter of this conference, without which there would be no conference. And thank you to all of you for coming along and listening to us. Thanks a lot.